So now we're down to let me just go back to that first one. What is this about? I told you the first one was about your overall design. The second one is about low-level detailed syntax. And so this is what an architect would call the working drawings, the things you put together to make a nice academic writing, something that people can understand and enjoy reading. So we're going to talk about all those S's, the style, the syntax, the semantics, and the structure. And among the other documents you will get is one with words and terms. That's a Word document. You will receive it. It gives you some nice ideas for words. But of course these days we've got a thesaurus, so you get fantastic things there as well. But what my little 2-page document does is also gives you a few phrases that are nice to use. Wherever you are in your research, it is much easier to write something that is hard to read. It's much more difficult to write something that is easy to read. That's why we need to review our own work. Very often, even if you're just writing an essay, you write it as you think. And then when it's finished, if your deadline is not midnight that day, leave it till the next day, read it again, and you will think, my goodness, what was she thinking about when she wrote that sentence? And oh my word, here's a huge gap. Obviously, she deleted something, but she deleted too much. Or else she added it in another way and she didn't delete the first. Just yesterday, I read a document that said the same thing in 2 ways in 1 sentence. So read your own work to check it and to make it easy to read. The other thing that we do tend to do is we've got a very important thought in our mind and we seem to express that thought too many times. And so that's when you can say, oh, come on. I will pick up the repetition in your writing, but I don't pick it up in mine unless I look at it the next day. I think, this is ridiculous. You've actually made that same point in 3 different places. Which has got the best words? Which is the best place? Okay, toss those, keep that. Now I'm going to help you to write something that is easy to read. But keep this. This is a long presentation. It says a lot. It's not all, most of it won't even be relevant now, but I promise you when you are busy writing up, if you come back and read this, it will honestly say, oh, wow to you. But anyhow, let's write it right now. Let's get it right now, but how? And here are a number of practical tips. And number 1 is the golden thread that your writing shouldn't be tied together. We don't want to see in the introduction that this is what you're going to do. And then at the conclusion, it's kind of a wrap-up, but we don't actually see how you addressed your research problem. Tie it all together. A very good way to deal with something is to start a paragraph with a lead sentence so that a person doesn't have to read your whole paragraph before they actually find out what you're dealing with. And this applies to the introduction, to the background, to data collection, to discussion. Make it clear from the beginning. Sure, you've got your paragraph heading, but very often a nice sentence can express it very well so that the examiner knows, okay, now I'm going to find out about this. I don't want to read through a whole lot of stuff and at the very end of the paragraph, okay, I get the point. And if that paragraph was half a page, then they've spent a bit of time being frustrated. Every day is Be Nice to Examiner's Day. And before that, it is Be Nice to Supervisor's Day. Try to smooth out their journey of reading your writing. This lead sentence is basically important everywhere. It's very important in literature review. It's also important in context and in presenting your results. Now, if you make an argument, which is a very strong point, you often need to back it up with evidence. So if you're making an argument, I'm talking about the second bullet, you will give that assertion and then you give some evidence, whether the evidence is from your findings because you're discussing your findings at the end, or whether it's from the literature. Back it up. Don't make sweeping statements without giving evidence or referring to the literature or to findings. You must give evidence and then you can discuss it. I did say to you earlier, it's very important to mention the literature that says what you wanted to say, right, the confirmations, but the contradictory beliefs are equally important. A student once said to me, I said to her, why haven't you referred to the work of, let's say it was Ehler? No, she said, because he suggests the opposite of what I did, so I don't want to talk about him. Good idea or mistake? It's a mistake. Why must she talk about his work and what and his perspective on it? Why? Anybody want to try the answer? Why must you mention people who say the opposite of what you plan to do? Because you've got to show how your situation is different, why what you're doing is right in your context. Of course, you have to really reconsider it. You know, is this guy right in what he says? But you need to mention it. It is very important. Third line up from the bottom. It's very important to include the opposing positions, to discuss them. So you say, on the other hand, so-and-so recommends. However, the approach of this study is in line with the work of Mkhize and Naidu. So you acknowledge the people who say something different. Don't hide away from it. In academia, it's all about debate and discussion, agreement, disagreement. And so go for it. Talk about it and say why you're doing what you are doing. But you know what? There's another place where surprising things can crop up, and that's when you get your results. Because very often, let's say you're doing a survey, and you kind of know, you think you know what you're going to read, but oh dear, you didn't. Or you've designed a prototype, and oh dear, it didn't work. I actually knew somebody who wrote a PhD 3 or 4 years ago and wanted to use a certain teaching method using e-learning. But sad to say, it didn't work. So she had developed this whole method and the results were not any better, they were actually worse, and the students didn't like using it. Now that's a bit of a toughie. Must I now say I've failed, my PhD failed? No, because it's not contract research for industry who are paying you to find a better, more efficient method of doing something. It's academia. The method she developed was well thought out. She used the literature. She used studies of students' needs, and she came up with this, and it didn't work. And she honestly said it didn't work. She did a lot of self-reflection and came up with some very good reasons why it didn't work. So, you don't only get contradictory stuff in the literature, you might even get it in your own findings, and then you are not a failure. If you get those surprises, talk about them, discuss them. And that lady sailed through her PhD. She wasn't a failure. It's just that the approach she took was not a successful one. And wow, I mean, that's fantastic. It's a practical contribution that particular approach she took didn't work for that group of students. Another thing is, don't be too dogmatic. In academic writing, don't try to be a politician on the podium. Just state the facts. All right, I already said to you when I check my own work, I find repetition. So avoid overuse, not just of making a point, but of a certain term. I've got a little paper with some exercises on it that I will show you. And there's a very good example there of somebody who really got stuck on one word. The second point we've already dealt with. Avoid duplicating a point in more than one sentence in a section. If you do find that you said it here and then you turn over the page and you made the same point again, just say, well, which one used the nicest words? Okay. And so use the best from both, combine it and say it once. Paragraphs should not be too short. It doesn't look good to see something in every paragraph has got 2 or 3 sentences, then there's white space, then there's another. Integrate them. You really should avoid paragraphs with only 2 sentences unless there's a very good reason for it, like your wrap-up. There you need it. Also your format. Now these days, it seems to me that the people who are editors of dissertations do not just do language editing, they also do something which we call technical editing. And technical editing means they will work on your indents and all that sort of thing. So, but in the meanwhile, do your best to get it looking good, even though for your actual thesis you will have an editor who will help you with consistency in bullets, consistency in indents. The same way, sometimes you make a new paragraph by having an open line. Sometimes you make it by means of a setting which on the underneath will put 10 spaces at the end of before each page break. So it's very important in these things to be consistent and make it look good. I don't think that your proposal is going to be seen by an editor. So it's very important for you to get it as good as you can, maybe swap around with your friend and look at each other's work. When I talk to you now, I can say don't and can't and avoid. Don't do this. I'm being dogmatic. I shouldn't be dogmatic in writing. I shouldn't say don't. There I must say do not. So please keep your writing formal. Also avoid sweeping statements. For example, implementation of the kiddie safe surveillance technique ensures safe security for juvenile smartphone users. You cannot prove that. Ensures, you see what ensures mean? It means it will definitely work. So you can say implementation of the kiddie safe technique will improve security, right? Don't be too strong. The next one, I love it. E-learning will transform education in Africa. Do you think it will transform education? It can certainly assist, but it may not transform it throughout Africa. It might transform it in a particular group, people like you. But you cannot say transform is too strong and in Africa is too strong. My goodness me. There are some places where e-learning will not be coming in Africa for quite a long time. So just be careful. Sure, make your point, but choose your words carefully. And also avoid strong adjectives, huge, excellent. There are a few places where it's true, and that is there is a massive number of internet users. Also avoid the words that are so nice. You know, it's really nice to use this word when I talk, but really and actually are lovely when we talk. But they are just padding in academic writing. However, at the bottom I've given you some words that are useful. However, nevertheless, although. However and nevertheless is what you use to show a contrast. You've said something, however, in a certain situation, right? Same with nevertheless. And then although. For example, that would have been very good for the PhD dissertation that proposed a certain method. If you're talking about that, you could say, although this new development did not improve learners' performance, it nevertheless made a contribution to their learning support. So things like that, those words are really nice to use. I've told you the paragraphs should not be too short. Now I'm telling you the sentences should not be too long. Just one idea or piece of information per sentence, maybe two, but please don't write a 28-word sentence, and don't say this and this and that and that and that. Keep it short. It's so much easier to understand. Another thing that we can't do is start with a numeric number. You can't say, third bullet, 9 participants agreed. You must write it in words. Then emphasis. And I remember with my PhD, which, you know, you write a PhD over quite a long period of time. When I looked at it, I found that when I wanted to emphasize a term in my literature study, I had used italics. In other places, I used bold. Here and there, I underlined it. Right, but then, fine, you know, while you're doing it, it happens. But that's where your personal read-through is very valuable. Even my supervisor didn't pick it up, because remember, the thing was written over a period, the actual write-up, probably close to a year. And so when my supervisor got it chapter by chapter, he saw the method of emphasis I used in that chapter, which was consistent. But when I saw the thing as a whole, I actually found I had used 3 methods. So I had to choose one. What I actually like is italics. But it's up to you. But just don't use too many of them. Having said that, of course, I have to say that on reading this presentation, I found that I did use different styles within this presentation. If you want to read the whole thing, you can judge and see. But why did I do that? Because of the particular context, each one, like where I used bold, it was because I really wanted it to shout. Where I used italics, it was perhaps a term you didn't know. And then also quote marks. Are you going to use single quote marks or double? But I did it there because I felt it enhanced the visualization. Like, look at that. 9 participants agreed, 9. Do you see that that underline just made those two things stand out better than bold would? It really pulled them out. And therefore, I'm not making apologies for using different styles in this, but not a good idea in a thesis. In many languages, European languages and certain African languages, they don't have the article. When I talk about it, I will say, yes, if you want to drink, you need a cup. But in many languages, they will say, if you want to have a drink, you need cup. European languages and African. But we are writing our dissertations in English. I just want to say how much I admire you. Now, I've got quite a good grasp of Afrikaans. I went to an Afrikaans university. I even learned to think in Afrikaans. But I would be, I don't know how I would write a journal article in Afrikaans. And yet all of you have a different home language from English. And yet you do your academic writing in English. I just want to say, I salute you. Well done. But there are things you need to know. So please remember the articles A and the. Look at that sentence underneath it. Oh, by the way, single quotes. I personally prefer single quotes. The second line, there is need for a study to examine impact of. Now, if you look at that very carefully, they did say a study, but they just said there is need. That sentence, by the way, is taken out of, with permission, taken out of somebody's actual writing. It should be, there is a need for a study to examine the impact of. And in that case, I did it in italics. So, not there is need for a study to examine impact. There is a need for a study to examine the impact. Also avoid saying the same thing by using two different sets of words. Look at that. Also taken out of a master's degree thesis. For the time being, the procedure will remain unchanged until further notice. So, which two little bits duplicate each other? What did I hear? I heard for the time being. What says the same as for the time being? Exactly. For the time being, it's going to be this way. Otherwise, I could say, it will be this way until further notice. But I don't need to say, for the time being, blah, 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 will happen until further notice. It's quite unnecessary. The improvement is simply, the procedure will remain unchanged until further notice. Now avoid, especially in a literature study, a long section of text, it rambles on and on. You are allowed to go in your dissertation up to 4 points in hierarchical numbering, right down to like 3.5.2.2. Some people don't like going that far. They are happy with 3 points. And then there's a lovely way of subdividing it, and that which is also a cue and a prompt to the reader. Before a section, you can put in a word which gives that theme. So if you want to deal, for example, with color visualization, then don't just talk about it. Let's say that you are talking about communication and you want to say color coding, how useful it is, and this goes on and on. But then you can start at the top, just bold italics or just bold, whatever is the style you've chosen for your dissertation, and you will say color visualization or color coding. And then you will write for half a page on that, and then you're coming to another thing which is important in the presentation, which is spacing. So you will put that word there. But look, you might well have used fourth level headings, but sometimes just a little semantic word to separate the sections so that it takes away of reader boredom, takes it away, and also it actually gives them a cue as to what is coming. So I like to do it with bold italicized, but you may want bold or just italicized. But please, whether you use numbering or whether you use thematic words, subdivide your writing. If you have a section that goes on for 2 pages without any break, I can guarantee your reader will get bored. So subdivide it, make it a visual pleasure to read as well as a mental pleasure. I will say this, when you write journal articles, which will come in due course, very few journals permit numbered subheaders. I don't know why, because they're so nice. For cross-referencing, you can say, as was stated in section 2.5.1. But in the journal, you've got to say, as was stated in the section about blah, blah, blah. So when you come to a journal article, that you will find out. But that's not for now. You are going to write a dissertation, go with your hierarchical numbering and enjoy it. Also, when you list a whole lot of things and you deal with this concept, comma, that concept, it is okay to have a comma before the final and. Another thing you might do to divide, I'm not talking about a very simple thing about words. The weather what a holiday. The weather was windy, stormy, rainy, da-da-da. Now, you'll just put commas between those. But if you want to actually give phrases, and they're in one sentence, it is quite all right to use semicolons because they are a bit stronger if the points that you are breaking with commas are 3 to 5 words. Headings must be concise and focused. Sometimes some journals actually have a limit on the number of words in a heading, which can be quite challenging. And I'm not just talking about your heading of the whole journal article, but actually your subheadings as they go through. But it's in your own interest to make them concise and focused. It doesn't have to tell a story, that's coming underneath. So keep them neat and easy to understand. Style of headers. Keep it consistent. If you don't get this right, your editor will probably show you. But you will have, in this chapter maybe, all of your headings will have all the main words starting with a capital letter. In the next one, only the first word, they call that sentence case, only the first word starts with a capital. So you may make your choice, but be consistent. When you come to your dissertation, you will not number your tables as table 1, 2, 3, right through to the very end in the chapter before the conclusion. Conclusion doesn't usually have tables in it, but the chapter before the conclusion, you are now at table 53. No, we number them according to the chapter. So chapter 1 will have tables 1.1 and 1.2. Chapter 5 will have tables 5.1 and 5.2 and 5.3, and chapter 5 is the results, might go all the way up to 5.25. That is it, likewise with the figures. If it's in an article, so this presentation might help you in 4 or 5 years' time when you're writing an article. Who knows? I hope so. I hope so. Who wants to publish when their thesis is over? Are you keen, or do you view your thesis pretty much as a means to an end, and then you will be able to carry on better with your work? What do you think? Are there people here who would like to publish? Right. Yes, you would like to. If you stay in academia, if you become a lecturer, you will need to. If you go back to business and you work there, then probably writing journal articles and presenting conference papers is not necessary. But I hope that you all have the experience of doing it at least one, especially a conference. Presenting at a conference is fabulous for network. But in the article, obviously it's table 1 through to table the end, and likewise with the figures. I love bullets. Some people don't. I work very closely with a man who hates any subdivision. But I love them, but it's very important to be consistent. You know, if you've got a dot or a little square or that little arrow, then stick to it. However, remember I said however is a nice word. There's an exception. And that is when you have bullets inside bullets. Please look at bullet 3. You must be, and that bullet, by the way, that's not just a dummy example. It's a point I want to make to you, but it's a point with subpoints. When you refer to authors, be accurate, be consistent. Which method would you use? Will you say in your journal article, not in your dissertation, we did this, because everybody's going to say, but you've signed at the front, it's your own unaided work, who's we? No, there's no we when you write your master's degree. But when you write a journal article, and perhaps your supervisor is the co-author, it's fine to say we. So one style is first person, we investigated. Some people even say I investigated. Or when it's only one person, it's more common to call yourself the researcher or the author, as in bottom bullet, the researcher investigated. Now that is a very important point I want to share with you. But you will see that I have got bullets within bullets, right? My main bullets are dot, dot, dot. My sub-bullets are a weaker form, a weaker notation. It's those little hyphen marks. So for bullets within bullets, use indenting and use a different style of bullets. But for your main bullets, if you're going to use those round ones, use them throughout your dissertation. Don't use different ones in different chapters. But if when you're checking your work, you find that in the literature study you were using dots, and in presenting your findings you were using arrows. It happens to all of us. I am the most guilty person at not being consistent when I write the first time. That's why I thoroughly enjoy a check. Earlier this week I had to meet a deadline, and I'm embarrassed to say I did not print out the whole thing and read it, and I just know, in fact I'm even too scared to go back and read it, because I know that there will be inconsistencies, there will be unnecessary repetition. It happens to all of us. Self-check. Self-check before you give a draft to your supervisor. You don't want your supervisor to be irritated, clearing up minor silly little errors that we all make. Don't already get your supervisor tense. Make sure that all the basics are right, okay? So that, sure, they are going to correct you. They are going to say, you didn't say enough about this. I think that you've overdone this section. You didn't need a page and a half, 2 paragraphs would have been enough. But let them concentrate on the academic content, not on silly mistakes you could have put right yourself. A word I've used so many times is consistent. Don't talk about first and second lines on line 1 word, on line 2 words, and on line with a hyphen, excuse me. Choose one, stick to it. S or Z, choose one. Just the day before yesterday, I was reading something in a published article, and they had two words in the same sentence, and one had an S and one had a Z. So you make up your mind. Are you an S person? Are you a Z person? Will you? So what do you like? Who are the S people? Okay, who are the Z people? Interesting, way more. Me, I belong in the minority. I'm an S person. Choose one style and use it throughout. Avoid Americanisms, except when it's in a quotation. If you have a quote from an American journal article in your literature study and they say behavior with just an OR, as you see in the first line of bullet 3, accept it, but it's in a quote mark, so it's okay. But for us, we live in South Africa. We are going to go for behavior, second line of bullet 3, behavior and color with a U. Also avoid informality. I said to you earlier, I can say don't when I talk to you, and I am now going to say don't use an informal style, although I would never write it. What informal style am I talking about? This is the section in which you're talking about your sample, about your participants. But you've got to choose them very carefully. They've got to be from a homogeneous environment. Or maybe you particularly want them for a heterogeneous environment. But you've got to know where your participants are coming from. You can't just go... So, here's a very important sentence. Bullet 4. It is important to understand the workplace of your participant. Now, when you present your work in a conference, by all means say that, but not in your dissertation. Chop that yaw. Look at third line of bullet 4. It is important to understand the participant's workplace. The point is important, it must be made, but avoid putting in you and your and that sort of thing. That's the way we talk to each other, but you would avoid it there. And then one of the biggest errors is comprises of. So many people say that the sample comprises of mid-level managers. No, the sample comprises mid-level managers, no of, if you like of, the sample consists of mid-level managers. That was so funny. I was giving a talk once on academic writing, not a long workshop like this, one quickie, and I was speaking in the room and they had up a banner about what their offerings were, and I will not name the institution, so we will call it ABC, and they said ABC's offerings, and here's this huge floor-to-ceiling banner, comprise of. And just at the moment when I said, don't use comprise of, I don't know why, I sort of turned around and there at the entrance near me was comprises of, okay? I said, oh, but your publicity people did it. But maybe they weren't academics, maybe they were good at banners, right? And it was a very nice banner. So avoid that. Another common problem is a long list of adjectives. Here is a sentence. A study is flawed by content validity, construct validity, systemic validity, and internal consistency problems. Those are all the kind of problems, but it makes your head spin. Look at the second bullet. Improved. A study is flawed when there are problems in content validity, construct validity, systemic validity, blah and blah. You get the idea. They don't have to be a long list of adjectives. Just turn your sentence around. But on the other hand, the last bullet, you could rephrase it completely using nouns. Look what a nice sentence the last bullet is. It is important to ensure content validity, construct validity, and systemic validity, as well as reliability and internal consistency. You see how I sort of grouped some things and I added as well as. Now, when you read that sentence, do you think that that sentence, does sentence 3 make a bigger impact on you than sentence 1 or 2? Not sure. I think sentence 3 is much better than the first one. You can see is terrible. You really don't understand it. The second one is an improvement, but the third one, I have rephrased the whole thing in a completely different way. Tenses. When you write your literature study and you are reading this book, you are allowed to use the present tense, because what that book says today, it says to you, it said the same thing to me 10 years ago. Of course, when it comes to, remember, when it comes to journal articles, you want to be pretty current. Avoid something of far away unless it was really a classical work. But when it comes to our textbooks, we can use quite old ones. And so let's say the author's name was Heading. And so we can say, Heading points out, because when you look at that book, Heading is pointing that out to you today and to me 10 years ago. So you can say Scott points out, PQR is characterized by, and you put Scott behind it, and Tambu claims that. You can use the present tense. But, there's always a but, however and a nevertheless, when you're talking about events, they happened. They are, as the Afrikaners say, finish and klaar. That's a mixture of English and Afrikaans. A study was conducted in China. And right now there's a lot of South Africa-China partnerships. There's some marvelous academic work coming from China. But you cannot say a study is conducted in China. Oh no. You read the book. You read the article. You say a study was conducted in China, and after his research, Mkhize found that, because they are events that happened, give them past tense. But when you just read something that's made, like Naidu proposes, then you say it in the present tense. When you refer to your work, conclusion chapter, what a lovely day to be writing the conclusion. You talk about your work in the past, even in presenting your results. So that first sentence, 3 lines up, this is in your data section. Results of the experiment demonstrated. Rather, not results of the experiment demonstrated, the results of the experiment that I did demonstrated. And then in your conclusion chapter, when you're wrapping it all up, and maybe you've made a contribution to knowledge by producing a framework, an evaluation framework, and you would say the framework was developed. But most important, do be consistent with tenses in the same section. It's always very difficult in your introduction chapter. I'll tell you why. Because you're writing a proposal now and it's in the future, right? But then your proposal plays a big part in your main work as chapter 1. But now chapter 1, you cannot say will be, because when you do chapter 1, it's already been done. But a lot of us slip up, and you find quite a mix of chapters, of tenses in chapter 1. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these with you, because I think you know these, but you just have to make sure that you get it right. Let's move right down to the third one, M-learning and e-learning, that's plural, are considered. The fourth one, the participant states. The participants state. And then let's just look at second last bullet. Look at the second sentence in it. This section aims to explain. Sometimes it's a bit difficult when something is not a person, because a section is a thing. And you might want to say, this section aimed to explain. But it is singular, this section aims to explain. There is one exception, and that is data. I was always brought up that data has an is, the data is singular. But more and more I see that people are taking data as there's lots of it. So they will say, in the last bullet, whereas I might say this data is contradictory, they will say this data are contradictory because they view it as a plural. Once again, it's a matter of what you choose, and the famous C word, be consistent. Something about hyphens. We don't know when to put them in. Well, I'll tell you. When it is an adjective, have a look at line 2, in a problem-solving situation with a hyphen, I must call on my decision-making skills. But look at bullet 2. When it's a noun, oh dear, we've got a real problem here. Having a strategic planning session, and the guy up front says to the rest of you, it is time for some, middle bullet, decision making. Because it's a noun, it's a thing we must do. But when it's an adjective, top sentence, you join them with a hyphen. Years ago, we used to have situations where hyphens were used much more than they are now. If you have a look at the last bullet and the second last sentence, we have subsections with a hyphen. Subdivide with a hyphen. Rephrase with a hyphen. But look at the middle one, look at the beginning of that, we now just say subsections, subdivide, rephrase, it's all one word. Acronyms can be a problem. Very often, and let me talk about myself, coming from the discipline of human-computer interaction and informatics, people will write about human-computer interaction, and maybe they're now like on page 4 of their introduction, and they've mentioned it quite a few times. All of a sudden they think, I don't want to write this out. So they put human-computer interaction, and in brackets they put HCI. But you should do it on the first mention. So you will probably have a heading that will say human-computer interaction, and then in that sentence you will say, in the discipline of human-computer interaction, and this is your first mention, put it in brackets there. Similarly, when you're talking about the place of your study, a lot of people these days come from parts of Africa. We're encountering a lot of research done by people who come from Nigeria, etc. So this study took place in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, on first mention. But I have a personal opinion, which not everybody would agree with, and that is that if you mention a certain concept in chapter 1, and then you mention it again in chapter 5, by that time, the person reading it might have forgotten. So I would say it's kind of okay-ish to expand your acronym and give the abbreviation on first use in each chapter. But then, of course, the other thing that you must do as well is at the beginning, bottom bullet, have list of acronyms in the front. Some people also call it list of abbreviations. So if they do come across HCI or DRC or IFT, they don't know what it stands for, they can quickly fly to the beginning. But I kind of think, if I'm only going to use this thing in chapter 1 and chapter 5, why don't I have a Be Nice to Examiner's Day and expand it and put it in brackets in chapter 5 as well? Because maybe they looked at chapter 1 last weekend. Okay, we all make changes. I've already talked to you a lot about removing something and so on. But there are impacts to moving material. So I will tell you a story from my PhD. My supervisor looked at my chapter 1 and he said to me, look at this, it's 2 pages on one topic. Yes, it's really good information, but it's far too wordy, it's far too much detail for chapter 1. It must go to the literature study. So being a very good and obedient little girl, I went home and I highlighted the whole thing and I said cut, and I swooshed the whole thing to my literature study. Well, a few months later, the supervisor saw chapter 1 again, and he said to me, good chapter, but I do not understand why you didn't mention ABC, because it's so important in your work. And I said, I did mention it. I wrote 2 pages on it, and you said take it out and put it in the literature study. Well, he almost said, you silly girl, but he didn't. His voice said it. He was very patient. He said, but you should have had a brief mention. Of course, how stupid I was. Which just shows that everything your supervisor says, you must take in context. What should I have done? I should have left a short mention of it, just a paragraph, because it was so important. And then in chapter 2, I should have gone in with my whole 2-page special. So, what I would suggest is this. When you do that, I think before you chop it, highlight it in red, then move it to chapter 2. And you see, the problem is that now you're working on chapter 2, you sort of forgot about chapter 1. You just used it to pick up something. But what happens is, if you highlight it, then the next time you look at it, whether it's later that day or on another day, you see red, and that red font says, hello, that stuff got moved out. What is important to leave behind? Then you take some time and you think chapter 1, and you think, what should be here? So then you have a reduced part left behind, and the main part has gone somewhere else. So, bullet 2 says, deleting might create a gap. Going away leaves a gap. A brief mention is needed. And so the last bullet says exactly what I told you. Don't use cut and paste. Use copy and paste for the first time, and perhaps highlight it in a color. Then later on, when you look at it, you can see, I've got to work on that. What do I need here? What key points fit in with the paragraph before and the paragraph after? What must I do here? But don't just chop. And of course, there is an impact at the new place. So let's say you take a 2-page thing and you stick it into the literature study chapter. But you know what? There might already be something in that chapter that relates to that. So after you have done your thing and stuck it in with copy and paste, you will need to read the whole chapter, because 10 to 1, something like that is already there. And so that's when we come back to what I've talked about several times, duplication and repetition. Have a look. Has this thing already been mentioned? If so, is it better there or is it better here? And also this new thing, chunk of text I've put in, does it flow from what went before? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's a bit of a jump, so I need to add a new lead sentence which fits it in. So remember, text must flow. So reread the whole section where you added something to make sure that the thread flows, and then read the whole bigger section or chapter to make sure you didn't duplicate something. We all duplicate, all of us. And then you just have to decide, where does it go best and how should I do it? Yeah, so there you see it, the two problems. Did moving that thing lead to repetition and duplication, or even more important, did it fit? If it didn't fit, rephrase so that your text flows. In your dissertation, don't only have an introduction chapter, start every chapter with a short... Yeah, I think so. Hello, those of you who are here, this paragraph which came up here was the last of my intended time before a break. So if that had happened 1 minute from now, it would have been perfect, because this is now moving on to something different. And I wanted a break just here. But we now have our break, so go for it. 10 minutes, and I will deal with this very quickly before I go on to tables and figures.